Hi! In this lesson, we will look closer at the local mobility stemming from the previous lesson on 15-minute neighborhoods. I'll reiterate some of the reasons why walking and cycling matters to the caregiver's need and also their babies and toddlers. I'll go over elements and actions that facilitate good walking and cycling conditions through the lens of mobility of care. We know that walking, along with cycling, are healthy, efficient, and affordable and comfortable ways of travel if the necessary conditions are present. For caregivers, walking is essential and it allows for convenient access to nearby destinations, and it provides opportunities to bond and interact with their children during travel. Walking also provides opportunities for play with the caregivers or siblings. Play is a form of brain stimulation needed on a daily basis for children's healthy development. In many places in the world, walking is the main form of transportation because of necessity and unavailability of other convenient transport options. In the process of urbanization and rapid growth of cities around the world, the car culture and car-centric approach dominated planning of streets. This has detrimental impacts on health, safety, and well-being of families and everyone else in cities. Streets planned only for cars lack safe infrastructure like sidewalks, crosswalks, and bike networks, as well as activities and stimulating environments that young children and caregivers need. Sprawl, an outcome of car-oriented development and poor planning choices found around the world, drives the sustainable development, often causing segregation of people. It creates long distances and excludes many populations that cannot afford a car, but also cannot access public transport or travel long distances on foot. In addition, low-income and informal neighborhoods have bloomed in cities, which adds to other issues: lack of connected streets for walking and cycling, and lack of planning and financing for sustainable transport modes. Car-oriented urban fabric and streets pose extreme issues to walking and cycling to anyone, but from the perspective of caregivers and the young children they care for, they experience even more barriers to walking and cycling. As too much of the street space goes to cars, the environmental conditions harm the babies and toddlers directly. They are more susceptible to car crashes involving pedestrians and have harder time navigating narrow, obstructed, broken, or uneven pathways. For cycling specifically, the main barriers are issues around safety, as the caregivers, majority of whom are women, are much less likely to cycle with their children when the conditions are unsafe. They also include considerations for conditions facilitating cycling with a toddler side by side or in a cargo gear. Lack of safe or convenient parking can also discourage cycling. Caregivers have different mobility patterns and needs. This is partially due to the socio-cultural norms, and this results in a different trip purposes, characteristics, and needs of access. Caregivers responsible for the well-being of their young children have different travel patterns than those not burdened by duties of childcare. On the left, we see a trip pattern of a person without child-caring responsibilities, and on the right, we see a chained trip of someone who travels to different destinations, often one by one, strategically, because of the necessity to satisfy different needs of their babies and toddlers. Some of those trips have to be done frequently on daily basis or multiple times a day, and some may have limited time, for example, to make it to a doctor's appointment and then to daycare. They have to also consider off-peak travel with more limited transport service. You can imagine how much more stressful and energy-consuming these trips are. Additionally, caregivers move much slower, stop more often to tend to their children, and experience encumbered journeys when they travel with more children under their care or with goods. Caregivers walking with toddler or pushing a stroller walk about 4 times slower than an able-bodied person walking alone. This walkability hierarchy of needs, found in the Pedestrians First Walkability tool, indicates that for walkability, the basic infrastructure requirements that create possible conditions is not enough. Walkability is enabled by conditions that foster access, safety, convenience, comfort, and enjoyment of walk, the qualities that are most often overlooked but are deal breakers in creating walkable cities, especially for those that really benefit from them, like the babies and toddlers. Now that we reiterated mobility needs and characteristics related to caregiving, we will now look at the elements that facilitate local mobility so that walking and cycling can be the preferred and most comfortable modes for travel for babies, toddlers, and those who care for them. So at the basis, streets should be planned as connected, sustainable mobility networks and as complete streets with ample space for walking, cycling, and public transport. This is important for laying out a foundation for new development because it is much harder and more expensive to retrofit places with disconnected and insufficient streets. Another important aspect for city and neighborhood level planning and street design standards is the size of street blocks. Long blocks mean longer travel times from point A to point B because of lack of detours, fine-grained street network and frequent and publicly accessible pedestrian pass-throughs, and shorter block lengths slow down traffic and increase walkability. Short blocks are characteristic of many historically walkable cities, while large blocks are typical in car-oriented cities. Pedestrian infrastructure needs to be first and foremost protected from moving or parked cars by curbs, bollards, or other design features. Walkways should be also adequate width to easily maneuver strollers and walk alongside with a toddler. They also should be smooth and unobstructed by parked cars, trash, or street activity, and well lit during the evening hours. Demarcated crosswalks are also important as they create safer walking conditions and help prioritize pedestrians. They also need to be stroller accessible and should include pedestrian refuge islands for multi-lane right-of-ways to help the slower-moving walkers cross safely. Shaded walkways, areas to rest, comfort stations, street furniture, and lighting are extremely important to caregivers' personal security and comfort of journey. Tending to young children includes frequent stopping to feed, soothe, and interact with the baby, and lack of supportive conditions reduces the quality of care the caregivers can give. Active and permeable frontages on the ground floor level help enliven the streets, increase personal security, and provide opportunities for local activity and destinations for the caregivers. They're enabled by land use policies, building codes, and street design guidelines that mandate mixed uses and permeability of street frontage. Implementing pedestrian infrastructure projects has direct impacts on everyday lives of caregivers and children. Those outcomes are measurable. The Chennai Footpaths and Pedestrian Plaza project, stemming from the city's non-motorized transport policy and years of collaboration of different city agencies and stakeholders, saw 8% of shift towards from private vehicles to walking. But we need to remember that improving basic conditions is not enough to foster walkability. Planning for complete streets for all sustainable modes of transportation should be at the center of mobility planning. Complete streets allocate space for all modes of transport, but by prioritizing walking, cycling, and public transport, they enable a much more impactful shift towards healthy, convenient, and more sustainable mobility. Cycling infrastructure can take different forms as protected and unprotected cycle lanes and shared streets, depending on street type, speed limits, local density, and others. But at the basis, the cycle lanes should be of adequate width for convenient travel of two bikes side by side or with a child in a cargo equipment, as they should ideally be protected from traffic. This is important as safety is the key issue for caregivers when considering cycling mode. Pedestrian and cycle networks need to be continuous and linked to key activities and services and leisure throughout the neighborhood and the city, as well as connect to public transport services. Implementing cycling infrastructure and growing cycling networks exponentially increases the number of cyclists on streets and improves street safety. For example, implementing cycling infrastructure in Jakarta in a span of just 2 years increased the number of cyclists by 340% on average in the whole city. Finally, bike parking, access to bike share, and bike equipment for carrying kids can be helpful ways to encourage caregivers to cycle. A big component of walkability and cycle friendliness is the healthy public realm that reduces stresses from cars such as air and noise pollution, especially detrimental for the healthy development of babies and toddlers. Healthy public realm is the outcome of different tactics that reduce impacts and interactions with cars, such as speed limits, traffic calming measures, reducing space for cars in car infrastructure, and repurposing it for open spaces, play areas, and greenery. Walkability and mobility in general depend on what can be accessed nearby. Local destinations both promote walkability and necessitate it. Caregivers need an array of care-oriented services located as close to home as possible. Earlier we discussed how babies, toddlers, and caregivers have mobility characteristics that inform shorter distances. When thinking about the neighborhood planning and locating destinations, we need to consider that 15 minutes for an able-bodied adult walking or cycling alone may mean 4 times longer distance for caregivers traveling with their young ones. Play areas can easily be incorporated in the public realm along street frontage, pedestrian footpaths, or near key local services that caregivers frequent with their young ones, like daycares, stores, neighborhood clinics, or even near public transport stops. Babies and toddlers learn through play, and play elements can also help caregivers distract the child during a stressful journey. They can include simple interactive elements like textures, colors, and installations. The non-motorized transport, street safety, and cycling policies need to include the perspectives of gender as well as the caregivers and babies and toddlers. They need to be grounded in qualitative and quantitative data for care trips and travel patterns, also including other intersectional lens like income and ethnicity. Data is crucial to setting policy targets and implementing priorities. Next, in order to get community input and buy-in, the cities can implement low-cost, high-impact pilots to produce quick wins and build consensus around sustainable transport and urban development interventions for children and their caregivers. Pilots can include temporary street closures for walking and cycling activities like the ciclovias, pilot bike lanes, or tactical urbanism pop-up plazas and play areas. Public awareness and participation need to be embedded in the process of creating policies, testing, and scaling up, and are the best way to truly reflect the needs of everyone, but especially the perspective or caregiving and needs of babies and toddlers. Finally, increasing cycling often requires targeted programs that encourage people to cycle. They can include setting up cycle trainings to teach people how to bike, cycle clinics, and pop-up repair shops, as well as local bike shops with affordable bike options and gear for transporting kids and goods, and community programs promoting cycling and bike share. You will learn more about examples of different tools in the next module, where we will dive into the policies and approaches to delivering cities for young children and caregivers.